Please join me in welcoming Mónica Ponce de León to USC.
I am really thrilled to be here today. Can you guys hear me? This is actually for me extremely special. Milton and I are very, very close friends, and we have been partners in crime for a long time. And I have to tell you, the two of us have gotten away with murder more than one time. So I am really excited to be here. When I learned that the theme of the series was capital, I couldn't help it but to smile, because, of course, everything that we do as architects very much is impacted by capital and impacts capital in ways that sometimes are overt and sometimes are more hidden. But my work has been really curious in relationship to the problem of capital, because I seem to operate at the two extremes. On the one hand, we've had clients at the very tippy top of wealth, clients that I am actually not allowed to name, even though Milton named them today. And at the other extreme, I have worked in very low budget projects for folks that are actually at the other end of the spectrum, and trying to make the same level of architecture in both instances, and trying to pursue similar bodies of work in both instances, for me has been very important. And so what I thought I would do today is give you a little bit of a background of who I am, and then actually dive into some of my recent projects, some of which are under construction, and actually talk about American themes, American types that have been vilified, as well as American types that have been loved but are changing, and maybe we can have a conversation around these topics. So sometimes I think that my early background is divided into those who interpreted the work as being obsessed with craft, and those who interpreted the work as obsessed with technology. And the truth is that I care about all kinds of making, and whether it's digital or not. For me, all kinds of making are culturally relevant, and therefore at the center of the way that I think about the world. As Milton mentioned, in the early 90s, me and my partner at the time, Nader Terrani, we were commissioned by the Museum of Modern Art to do an installation in the courtyard. And for me, what was important was the idea that you can take something as simple as a sheet of steel and turn it into origami, but through parametric geometricism, which was actually drawn by hand, by the way, you can actually reconstruct the flatness of the sheet of metal, so that architecture may operate between geometry, space, occupation, and materiality in just a single instance. And this kind of research onto materials and fabrication is something that has been parallel to my work, that has informed the work. But I have always worked very hard to move fluidly between installation and building, and not remain only at the installation scale. This, for example, was a project that I did with Wes McGee and collaborated with many students on it at Harvard University. We were working with the robotic arm for the first time, and we were trying to understand how to take stone and use robotic fabrication as a way of precisely cut it really thin, and then transform the way that stone works, make it somehow immaterial. And these kinds of lessons actually stay with me over time. My obsessions don't escape me. This is a project that is just being finished in Wellington, New Zealand. It's a World War II memorial, and for the US government in New Zealand soil. And the kinds of lessons that the students and I learned together at the GST actually informed very much how this was conceived and fabricated. Always thinking of larger issues, like, for example, in this installation that I did with students at Georgia Tech, how do you think of digital fabrication as a way of revisiting construction techniques, that you might actually design a joint so that you don't need scaffolding to build something really large, that the joint may actually become the guide for the assembly and for the shape. And then thinking in a way of technology transfer, how do you bring that into production, into commercial projects? This is a restaurant in Boston. You may have seen this gas station here in Los Angeles. The gas station very much came out of smaller fabrication projects. And it was really, for us, a way of thinking of the gas station as a prototype that could be repeated. And understanding actually that the site is going to put pressures in every project, and you can think of a prototype as actually a series of components that then deform to perform different functions. So, for example, the idea that component, the mushroom column, so to speak, would actually deform and distort depending on whether it's at the edge of the site, whether it's pushed away by something like a billboard. I don't know how many gas stations have billboards, but ours did. Or may actually even grow and become a room so that you actually have a space where you can actually go and pay for your gas. But the idea that actually architecture can move seamlessly between one scale of element into another and actually transform completely as you go through a series or a sequence is something that has, for me, been very, very important. Now, historically, my work has been thought of in terms of aggregation and a certain obsession with putting little pieces together. So I always think it's healthy to be self-critical. So at a certain point, I decided that I wanted to move the work into a direction where we could explore actually seamlessness. So rather than working with the notion of how do you put together an aggregation of components, we worked with the idea of how do you create the most seamless environment. Now, to create a seamless environment is very difficult because if you guys look at your own ceiling here, you have all kinds of things you have to address, from supply air to return air to lighting to sound systems to fire suppression to video cameras, right? So what we decided to do for this space, for a corporation in Lower Manhattan that I cannot disclose the name of, we decided to actually put all of these things into one single line and to make that line the width of 3.5 inches. So within this crack, we have lighting, supply air, etc. All of it seamlessly integrated into the system. Now, of course, these things have different criteria, different logics, different ways of operating. So actually, you cannot make a grid, you cannot make a straight line. It's very difficult to actually put them in the same line. So the geometry that you see in the space is the result of the mechanical engineer telling us where they thought their returner should go. Connecting the dots between the different categories is really how this sinuous line was developed. Now, because this is for a corporation that shall not be named, we were not actually able to photograph the end product. So you're actually looking at photos that were, in a way, superstitiously taken during the process. So I'm actually giving away the punchline. What I discovered, thank you. What I discovered during the process is that actually seamlessness is not possible, and that everything in contemporary construction is actually made out of pieces, made out of parts, and that seamlessness is an effect that we can aspire to through architecture. So this is the ceiling, is made out of fiber reinforced glass. And you can see how it's panelized, and the panels were prefabricated off-site and then brought to site. And they're actually all very different. Some are designed to receive an acoustical plaster. Some are access panels that drop, which is what you were seeing in this view. And some are actually just flat because they don't need to perform any kind of function. So when it came to the final product, I couldn't resist it and decided to actually give a hint of the variation by actually using slightly different textures to the plaster, so that the glossy is when it's flat and the more rough is when it's acoustical, and then everything in between. So while there is a clear trajectory of obsession with material and tectonic units and components, the other strand in the work has been one that focuses on space and on typology, and actually on the relationship between material characteristics and the morphology of a building. So I'm going to show a sequence of projects that deal with certain American typologies, and hopefully this will become a springboard for conversation. So the first typology I want to discuss is the single-family home. The single-family home used to be, of course, the classic American architectural problem. Students in architecture schools were always given a single-family home. It was expected that you would be doing a single-family home at some point in your career, potentially for your parents. But of course, as it turns out, the single-family home, instead of a dream, it really turned out to be more like a nightmare. Now we think of the single-family home almost as evil. Suburban sprawl is, of course, something that we should all be concerned with. So academy seems to have abandoned single-family home as a topic of exploration. But the reality is that as the cities become wealthier and wealthier, we are moving folks out of the city into the suburbs, and they're actually occupying single-family homes. So I actually don't think we should quite abandon the problem of the single-family home as of yet. So this was for me an incredible opportunity. My husband and I could not afford to buy a house in Princeton, so we decided to build one. And we decided to think of it as a prototype that dealt with the problem of time, that dealt with the problem of how to live in the house as you go through different time frames. We got really fortunate that we found a lot that has a lot of trees. So in that sense, it's sort of an ideal suburban lot. It's not a dense site. So because of that, I started looking actually at mid-century houses when the quote-unquote American dream was still alive and well. And this is Elliot's Noyes house in Connecticut. It was a house for him and his family as well. So I was very interested in the idea of the single-story house, which seems to have fallen out of fashion in recent years. So very similarly, we are doing a single-story house, and the intent is that the house is equally somehow nested within the woods. Now, when I think about the history, the way that we're taught history and domesticity in schools, I think about two polar opposites. We are always taught in terms of palladio, poche, a sequence of rooms, and on the other hand, we are given lessons about the free plan and the invention of the free plan actually through domestic interventions. You know, immediately comes to mind the Farnsworth house by Miss Van der Rohe. I've always been more fascinated actually by Philip Johnson's houses and the way that he bastardizes the idea of the free plan. So I chose to put the glass house instead of Farnsworth house because of the sort of erroneous location of the object of the bathroom. It's not in the center, it's off to the side. I always feel like some good architect will come and actually push it in. But the idea is that you could actually imagine a lifestyle where you're actually, it's more of a loft condition where the plan is open, and then the bathroom as well as the kitchen, and I'm sorry that the drone is projecting so light, but that the bathroom as well as the kitchen as well as the low partition become sort of objects that float in a space and actually give it some sort of programmatic definition. The other project that for me has always been an obsession, and I wanted to see if it could be experimented with, is the Schroeder House by Redville. For those of you who don't know it, this is a very rarefied program, more rarefied than the Glass House for Philip Johnson. It was designed by Redville for a single mother and her children. And even though it's a two-story house, they primarily really lived in this floor, and the floor was completely open during the day. And then at night, they actually slid partitions, and they created rooms out of the sliding partitions. And the bathroom is particularly impractical in that the bathroom really collapses during the day and then opens up and becomes a room later. So while this is quote unquote impractical, I was interested in the ideas that it embodied. The fact that actually we do things differently throughout the day. We do change through our lifetime. And somehow our domestic structures don't seem to register these changes. So I began with the notion of placing the fixed things like the bathrooms as floating objects that allow the space to really change throughout the day and be fluid. So at one point, the plan can be understood very much in the tradition of Philip Johnson as a free plan with a series of volumes that hold the roof. But embedded within these volumes are movable panels. Sometimes I call them doors, sometimes I call them walls. But the idea is that depending on the position of the door/wall, you actually can experience the space differently and use it differently. So at one level, the house is very conventional. Master bedroom, 2 kids bedrooms, a guest room, a family room, a kitchen, a living room, etc. So what is interesting to me is that at that time of day when you need privacy, by opening the oversized or closing the oversized doors, you actually develop a floor plan that is very cellular and that is actually very segregated. So the intent is that the house can oscillate between free plan and poche throughout the course of the day. But of course, you know, we'll occupy it whichever way we occupy it, and life will take whatever road it might take. So because the house is one story, the roof became really important. And the idea that the roof is really just an elevated ground to be occupied in the same way as the ground. So the idea that the roof is accessible is central to the concept of the project. The house has a courtyard that is open to the sky. Because it's one story, we wanted to make sure that every space had light. And the courtyard then becomes that access point for the roof. But instead of thinking of the independence between the cores and the roof, as Philip Johnson did, I really felt that the permanence of the cores was significant, and that the permanence of the cores should have an impact on the volumes of the house. So actually, each of these cores projects through the roof, seeking light, and you can think of them as three-dimensional volumes that are actually cut inside the plane of the, inside the thickness of the house itself. So not only do they bring light to each of the bathrooms, they also become a landscape in themselves. So while the roof might be thought of as an elevated landscape, it is an artificial landscape. And then the skylights for the different core functions become objects, almost like a still life, on the plane of the roof itself. Now, one of the motivations for the project was the idea that the project could change over time, not just over the course of a day, but over the course of a lifetime. So each of the cores is actually designed so that it can change from a bathroom and a walk-in closet to a bathroom and a kitchenette, and from a bathroom and a storage area to a bathroom and a kitchenette. So we expect that at the beginning we will be using this as an office, not as a guest room. So all of the partitions are designed so that you can actually close it off and not understand that there are doors that take you to the house. When I talk about these doors, they have the same finish as the walls. And the idea is that when they're closed or open, they're seamless, and you actually don't expose the door frames. When our children grow up and go to college, and my daughter hates this idea, we plan to rent their bedrooms as studios, apartments, and actually, again, their closets are designed so that they can then receive kitchenettes as furniture. What we have done is that we have already embedded within the building the kinds of technologies that you will need in the future. And then, our plan is that as life takes, its course, that then our office will then become another rental unit. And that over time, the project can actually be divided in multiple ways. Whether we decide to divide it into 4, into 5, or into 3, 4, or 5 units, we might actually move out of the house and then divide it into multiple rental units. But the intention is to design a building where different points of access allow the building to be subdivided over time. So, in parallel with working on the house project, we were commissioned to do an office building addition to a factory. So another classic American problem, the workplace. And we were given, the expectations of the project were very, very common for what has happened in America historically. This is a classic photo of the Union Carbide building in New York City, and you can see the offices in the perimeter, and then the secretarial pool in the center. Offices then claim the light of the exterior. This is where the corner office was originated. And of course, a very classic version of this is the Johnson Wax building, where the executive offices are in the perimeter with windows, and they're looking down at the secretarial pool in the center. So we decided to invert, to mess with the model. And we decided actually that nobody will get, that in principle, nobody will get windows. And we placed all of the offices that needed privacy, that needed to be subdivided for different reasons, on the ground floor. And then we will have an open floor plan on the second floor. Also, because of budget reasons, we actually could not afford that much glass and that many windows. So we decided to concentrate all the windows in the front of the building, which is the west elevation, and actually do simple block walls on the north and the south. So then the project became really a way of seeking light. First, we deny light from everyone, basically, and then we figure out how do we give light back. So the west wall, which is where we placed all of our windows, really became an opportunity for us to explore how do we limit light so that you don't end up with glaring light into the building. So we developed a series of brisolets then modulate the light so that the light never actually hits the glass. And then we thought of the second floor as very much a free open space that could be deployed in multiple ways, while thinking of the lower level, again, as one that was very solid and that was really driven by this problem of subdivision. So we started thinking of ways of puncturing through the free plan into the lower level and actually dissecting the section so that light could actually travel through the entire floor plan. Now, so it happens that factories have these skylight systems that are really inexpensive, that are called solo tubes, and the factory that we were attaching the project to had solo tubes. And trusses in factory ceilings are really, really deep, not much shallower actually than the depth of a regular office floor. So we have the solo tubes penetrating through the office plate. Sometimes we double them. We vary the size of the solo tube depending on what was needed in the ground floor, but also sometimes we put two together, again, depending on what was needed in the ground floor. And that created then a variety, that then created a variety of thicknesses for the light shafts that produce the effect of variation within the space. So rather than work with a certain notion of repetition that is somehow always embedded in the idea of the workspace, we wanted the idea of bringing light to then create that de facto effect of variation and, if you want, chaos. Now, one of the interesting side effects of the idea of the project is that then the structural grid actually gets subsumed and is no longer understood as the regulatory system for the project, and really is the inner workings of the office spaces below that impact the location of the quote-unquote columns above, and then affect how the furniture is laid out, which then makes an impact on the artificial lighting that is placed on the second level. Now, I'm showing pictures of the project under construction, and what has been interesting is that, you know, rarely, if ever, is there the need to actually turn the lights on. So another prototypical project that I am very interested in is the role that libraries play in the public life in America. So if the first project focused on the domesticity, the second project focused on the workplace, this project really focuses on public building in the US. You know, libraries today really have taken a lot of the jobs that public services used to do in the United States. Pompano is a suburban community. This is a photo of the site before it happened. The income level of the community is rather low, but also it's a community that has been historically divided. So this is a map of Pompano, and these are railroad tracks, and it's quite striking to actually see the demographics in relationship to the railroad tracks. So east of the railroad tracks is primarily Caucasian, and then west is primarily Hispanic and African American, and there's one area that is primarily African American. The library used to be right here in the center of the Caucasian neighborhood. The Caucasian neighborhood tends to be older in age, and the African American and Hispanic community tends to be younger in age. So they have very different ideas of how the library should be used. the city of Pompano got funding for the library in conjunction with funding for a cultural center. And they decided very smartly to move the library really at the intersection of the three demographic groups. Now, what is exciting about the combination of the two programs is that the funding was for technology. So both the library and the cultural center were expected to use technology in innovative ways. And in fact, this is not a conventional cultural center. It's called a Cultural and Media Arts Center. And they're actually using the cultural center as an incubator for technology. So both artists and entrepreneurs are using the facility as a way of advancing different kinds of careers for people in the community. The challenge, however, was that I had two different clients, very different ideas, very different attitudes towards public life, and they were never in the room at the same time. So when we were commissioned, we were told that the project would be 2 levels, basically 2 stack pancakes. The head of libraries, not the librarian, but the head of the library district, the Broward County Library District, wanted the door in the back. And the commissioners of Pompano Beach wanted the door in the front. So you can already see the conflict. And I always say that I never thought in all my years of practice that I will have a client tell me they want the door in the back. So that was difficult for me. But actually, one can see the point. While public transportation is in the front, and those who do not have cars clearly were going to come from the front, which is is more than 50% of the users of the building. The elderly in Pompano really drive, and they would have come from, quote unquote, the back, because that's where parking is easily accessible. So while these two mentalities did not seem to make sense to each other, once you actually sorted through the specifics, then the ideas behind it or the motivation behind it became really clear. So the impetus of the project actually was then how to break away from the preconceived notion of the building and use this as a catalyst for a new way of thinking about the building. So we sliced the pancake, we twisted it, and we turn each program into each other, so that no longer is a library one floor, no longer is a cultural center another floor, but instead they almost behave as Janus heads, where both programs have a presence in the ground and both programs have a presence in different sides of the building. And then we design what we call the breezeway. We design an open space that actually connects the quote-unquote back of the building with the quote-unquote front of the building, and both doors are within view of each other as a way of addressing this issue. So we were also commissioned to design the plaza in front of the building, so the breezeway really allows that movement from one side to the next. The project was recently completed, and I haven't taken good photos yet. I have some iPhone photos that I'm going to show you. But what I think is important about the building is the way that we engage the typology of the building as a way of solving the conundrum of space, but also how we really accepted the quality of materials that is typical of construction in South Florida. So for us, the geometry of the columns was a way of activating the space. The breezeway at the beginning and at the end is actually very low because of the way that the building climbs. It's only 12 feet, which is more of a residential quality. But by playing with the geometry of the columns, we were able to give it a certain sense of monumentality. Now, one of the advantages of the way that we manipulated the type is that it allowed us to place the reading room on a higher level. The senior citizens did not want to be near the children's reading room. Libraries in America have become the daycare centers of those who could not afford childcare. Many mothers dropped their kids in libraries. The seniors were mounting a protest against this practice. Librarians are welcoming as many people as they can, of course. So by elevating the reading room, we actually create a certain level of separation without isolating either group. So as a result, we have children that can roam freely and loudly, while the seniors are occupying the space above. Now, the cultural center behaves similarly. In the ground level, we place those activities that are active during the day, and then the black box, which also doubles as a performance space, and as a event space for weddings, for quinceañeras, etc., was actually located on the second floor. So we paid close attention to the way that the building will change over the course of the day, and the idea that the second floor towards the street was actually quite quiet during the day because events happen to be more frequent at night, and the idea that the building may change depending on the weather, that as clouds pass by, the windows might actually be wider because of the reflectivity of the glass that we used. And then at night, of course, when there's an event in the building, which happens almost every night now, then the building will glow. So we wanted to somehow register this passing of time in the building itself as well. Now, I have to say that during the whole process, I wanted the building to be a box because it's less expensive to do a box, and the community kept on arguing that they did not want a box, that they had hired us so that we could do really something interesting for them. And at the beginning of the process, when we had focus groups and discussions about what should the building look like, they argued for two things: that it should not be a Mediterranean-style building, because that has certain connotations in South Florida, but also that it should not be an international-style building, because that also has other kinds of connotations in South Florida. That to me, I have to say, was a surprise. So during the opening, the mayor said, we asked the architects not to do a box, and by golly, they didn't do a box. So it was pretty sweet. So the last project I want to show is another American classic type that perhaps has less cultural interest, less cultural connotations, but is one that actually has become identified with America worldwide. And it's the Atrium Hotel. The reason why I'm fascinated by the Atrium Hotel is because within the Atrium Hotel, we seem to have gathered a lot of our aspirations of what public life is all about. They tend to be very tall spaces. They tend to be, they tend to have sort of a sense of infinity, you know, the balconies that go endlessly. We also, you know, embrace things like technology, the idea that you can be in an elevator and see yourself moving up and down in space. But also, we want to play God, of course, and we bring trees and put them inside. So we, you know, we capture nature, we capture landscape. This actually is not an Atrium Hotel. This is actually a film still from Alexander Korda's Things Yet to Come. But I find it amazing how all of the components of the Atrium Hotel are already embedded in the 1930s imaginary of what the future is. Poorman, of course, is the master of Atrium Hotels, and when I was young, I stayed in the Bonaventure here in Los Angeles, and I was just amazed. I thought it was like the future is here, most amazing space. And then when I was teaching at Georgia Tech, I made a point as a visiting critic to stay in his hotels as well, just because I find them really fascinating. So we were asked to remodel a hotel in New York City. And of course, rather than being lucky and having something as amazing as a Pullman to renovate, we were given an embassy suites. And this is actually what I was given. And I cannot, I've looked everywhere for photos of what we were given, and I can't find them. It looks like we didn't bother to photograph it, and then it got demolished. And then the first time that I tried to put a lecture together, I realized, oh shoot, we didn't photograph it. So you have to forgive me, because you're gonna have to rely a little bit on my description of what we got as I get through this. So you have to trust me that these balconies are drywall, and that when you knocked on them, they sounded hollow. So it was a really suburban construction, but escalated and multiplied into a 14-story structure. However, the location is quite brilliant. It's at the bottom of, it's at Lower Manhattan. It's right in front of the Potato Famine Memorial, right next to the ferry. It's bounded by two streets that really play with the grid of Manhattan. And also is bounded on one side by a fantastic public walkway whose glass ceiling was designed by Scott Cohen. In Battery Park in Lower Manhattan, there's a requirement that all lobby spaces should be treated as public rights of way. So actually, it is required by the city of Manhattan that you should be able to walk from one end of the building to the other. And what I'm highlighting here is the space that we were given to work with. But as you can see, one of the challenges in this requirement in Lower Manhattan is that the other requirement is that everything be 20 feet from the ground to prevent flooding. So you have on the one hand the requirement to be public, on the other the problem of flooding. So as a result, the space that we were given looked like this. I still don't know where the public right-of-way was. I mean, I suppose you could meander through and end up on the other side, but you can see that it did not have a character at all of being public. The other component of the project is that there is a multiplex that is on the site, that is this big box that is putting a great deal of pressure on the volume of the atrium. Now, the previous developer, and I'm sorry I don't have a proper photo, in order to deal with this, painted the entire box with a solid drawing. And I'm only showing you this corner of it. Unfortunately, there's a big surface here that has the solid. So you can see how the poor solid and the multiplex was sitting uncomfortably on bamboo planters, and very much a solid line and a solid wall at the bottom. So our first move was to free the solid and actually open up the space as much as possible and make it more of a plaza, make it more of a public space, change the materials of the space so that they were public, dealing very much with a certain notion of publicness and taking very seriously the charge that this is a public right-of-way. The second idea was to connect seamlessly one end of the project with the other and actually coordinate the access to the elevators so that they are not secret and they're not hidden. So we went from this to this, very much opening up the space again so that the ground and the elevated public plaza could be seamlessly related. Of course, the elephant in the room again is the solid drawing. It's big. It's several stories high. And I have to say that during the job interview, I told the client that we should paint it It's about the stupidest idea I have ever had. I cannot believe we got the job, even though I said this. He very nicely said, no, we're not doing that. So once I realized we had to contend with an elephant, and by the way, now I love the painting, the drawing. They called it a drawing. Now I love the drawing, and I will be devastated if anybody painted it. So I feel really embarrassed that that was my design strategy. So once I realized we had to really develop an honest strategy about it, one of the first moves was to hide the elevators. The atrium, like any good Atrium Hotel, had glass elevators, and you could look down and, you know, get dizzy. And they were an object right next to the silhouette. So what we did is that we applied a surface to them. You can still see through, but it's much more muted. You hardly understand that they're there, and it allows the silhouette then to be framed and take center stage. So we thought of veiling as a strategy, but of course it can't just be a proscenium because the silhouette is an object, it's not a painting. So we were thinking more of the kinds of strategies that happen in three-dimensional arenas and in three-dimensional theaters, or the idea that we might actually, again, encapsulate a natural phenomena or recreate a natural phenomena, not unlike Diller-Scofidio Renfo's strategy of the blur. The idea that you might actually somehow architecturalize the effect of nature, the effect of the outdoors inside the building. So this is how we came up with the notion of hanging veils in the space. It was a way of maintaining and respecting the scale of the space while still somehow taming the vertiginous quality that happens in these spaces and creating some differentiation within the space. We sized the veils very specifically, and we placed them really carefully as a way of developing a conversation between the public space and the silhouette. Now, because the site is caught between two streets that are not parallel to each other, the movie theaters put pressure on the space. So, and there is a certain structural grid that is triangular actually on the existing skylines of the space. We were working with the notion of triangles, truncated pyramids, as a way of developing the geometry for the veils. We also slice them so that from certain points of view, they expose more or less of the silhouette unencumbered. And these are things that you discover as you exit the restaurant or you exit the gift shop or you go into the conference center. So while each view was again carefully calibrated, we also worked very carefully on the shaping of the bottom of the veils. The geometry of the veil is given by the shape of the bottom. The bottom we nicknamed the lower ring, and the lower ring not only gives it its shape, it also has the function of lighting the lobby at night. These lower rings make a virtual surface that allows you to be in the lobby without feeling that you are somehow lost in, again, the vertiginous quality of the space. But also, we shaped the balconies, so we got rid of those flat drywall surfaces, and instead we did something really inexpensive. We shaped corian as a way of being able to produce variation from the bottom to the top. The reason we needed variation from the bottom to the top was acoustical, so that the acoustics in the lobby worked, so that you would not get lost when you were sitting in the lobby and you could hear each other. So if you notice in this photograph, these are folded more acutely than the ones at the top. And it also allowed for different experiences as you go through the building. Now, veils then became for us very much a theme. And as when we came to work on the conference center, we decided to work with a suspended staircase as a way of architecturalizing the veil even further. So if the veils belong more to the world of art installation, then in the staircase we demonstrate how you can actually do it through a structural idea. But in the case of the conference center, the stair then becomes an organizer for the space. And the geometry, again, is very much coming from the existing geometry of the streets. Now, you may have noticed in some of the previous images that the upper part of the veils was a flat frame. At some point, we came to the realization that in order to clean the existing skylights, we needed to accommodate a cleaning basket. And the basket actually put pressure on the geometry of the upper frame. Then that geometry was shaped as a way of keeping good company with the silhouette drawing. So I am not sure if I touched upon the topic of the series enough, so I would love to answer questions throughout as a way of perhaps coming back to some of the things that I went through in the presentation that may actually bring the topic back to the surface. And I'm just going to let the video play, but if you guys want to ask questions, I could take them now. Thank you so much. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Sorry. Ah, what did I just do? I'm sorry. There we go. Okay. Questions? Yes.
Thank you, Monica. That's fantastic. What is your attitude about the difference between the core of architecture? I think Scott wrote an article, The Hidden Core of Architecture, between that and the interior surfaces of architecture. Do you, as a designer, do you have a position on whether the work is more important or fundamental, if it's dealing with the core of the architecture or if it's dealing with the surface or dealing with the space of experience?
I think that the reality of our time is that the surface is as important as what is inside the surfaces, that they're no longer, you can no longer separate them. And it depends on the project. I mean, there are projects where the architecture is exclusively on the surface. And if you were to change the surface, then the project radically changes. And there are projects where, no, actually, the surface could be something else, as long as the form and as long as the structural logic of the project continues. But I think more and more in the second half of the 20th century, the surface has come to be equally, if not more, important. So that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is has to do with architecture's capacity to represent. And I am more interested, actually, that's a personal interest of mine. It's not a moralistic judgment. But I'm more interested in those projects that do not have a one-to-one correspondence between skin and interior, or between interior and exterior. So for example, while the purists might say that Farnsworth is better than Seagram's, I far prefer Seagram's over Farnsworth. I'm much more excited by the intellectual jump that had to happen in Farnsworth. I mean, in Seagram's. And what I mean by this, if you look at the Seagram's building, Ms. van der Rohe places, of course, the steel inside the concrete because of fireproofing regulations in New York City. And then he applies I-beams as window mullions to the exterior, right? Whereas in the Farnsworth house, what you see is what you get, and the structure and the window mullion are one and the same, right? So I'm much more interested in the intellectual jump of Seagram's than in the one-liner quality of Farnsworth. But I think that's a personal preference more than anything.
Thank you. Here's a straightforward question. I would say, what is the key for us as architects to finally find the right contractor to do a job the right way?
So, that's a great question. So, no, and when I present the work, a lot of people misinterpret it as being expensive or as somehow me working with the same contractor over and over and over and getting excellent results. And that has not been my luck. I have found myself having to adapt myself to different contractors for different jobs, right? And even having the same client does not translate into the same contractor. So, for example, the servery, the dining hall, the white ceiling was a very good contractor for a very good client, very expensive per square foot, which allowed us to do smooth. I was like, this is when we're going to do smooth because we're never going to have this kind of opportunity ever again to not have seams, right? The same client then commissioned us to do the hotel, completely different price point, not even remotely close to the other budget that we had, because it was a commercial investment for them, and a terrible contractor. The veils were subcontracted, and the subcontractor of the veils was fantastic, thank God. So we did things like Corian as a way of ensuring that we would get shape in a very cheap way, Same with Pompano. Pompano is a really low budget project. So, and this is why I wanted a box, because I thought a box will be cheaper. Actually, no, the geometry is better, because when you do a box, the box better be perfect, So it's interesting that sometimes what we assume to be expensive turns out to actually be a better strategy. If something is not slightly straight in Pompano, nobody notices but me. You go through it, you don't know that the angle was supposed to be a little bit more acute or a little, right? Whereas when it's a box, the thing better be 90 degrees, right? So I don't know. I get pleasure out of not out of bad construction, but I do get pleasure out of the kind of architecture that can come up from challenges. Like, thank God that I had two clients that didn't agree, and one wanted the door in the front and the other in the back, because then I probably would not have done as interesting a project, ultimately, in my opinion. So, does that answer the question?
My question is actually about these shapes. You mentioned that there's lighting in them. Mm-hmm. Does the power go through the wiring? One of them?
The power goes through a couple of them, and you don't notice it at all unless you're in the very, very top, and then you see the extra wire hooking into it. So,
I want to ask you about something that emerges, I think, as you move through the different types that you talked about. I guess one is kind of the notion of subversion versus irony. So I think that
never irony. Never irony.
There are moments where I think some of the tropes architects have used to kind of to move beyond certain expectations from client or from public is through representation and spatial and physical kind of manifestations of irony. And I'm wondering about that in relation to what seems to be a through line in your work, which is the notion that that one can look at different components of the architectural problem, whether it be program, community engagement, technology, fabrication, for moments to, for ways in which you can be subversive in ways that you have control over versus the forces of capital. So I'm wondering if that is something that you're intentionally seeking in each project, and how you see that project emerging going forward.
It's an interesting question. I'm actually, at the end of the day, really earnest. Like, when I start a project, I want to make sure at the end of the project, like, my priority ultimately, and I'm going to sound really Pollyannish, so forgive me. At the end of the day, I really want the users of the project to be super happy with the building. Like, if they're not super happy, it really bothers me, you know? So I really want the function to work. Now, that doesn't mean that if they say, I want the door in the back, I blindly give them the door in the back. In fact, I had arguments with the head of libraries where I told him, I said, you realize that public transportation is in the other side. You are going to be known as the guy that gave his back to the community. He almost died when I said this, and I said it in a meeting. I said it very nicely. I said it in a public meeting. I said it very nicely. And he was taken aback because he didn't expect that to come out of my mouth. And he said, well, certainly I don't want to be known as the guy that gave his back to the community. However, you still have to put the door in the back because my elderly people cannot walk the extra 5 feet. Actually, I'm being unfair. The extra 60-something feet. And I see his point. I mean, I met all these people, right? So I understand where he's coming from. So that to me has always been a priority. But at the same time, I see this as the catalyst for new ideas, different ways of thinking about it. Like, I love these moments in projects when a client says, oh, but wait, I really need X. Because then a lot of the motivation behind the work really comes from this kind of trying to truly fulfill the aspiration of the project, either for an individual client or for a community, and really seeking new ways of thinking about it. You know, Sylvia Levin has talked about the work in terms of deformation. And I always think actually of these deformations as things that come out of me creating problems and solving them, right? Like the light, the sort of the overblown columns that kiss each other. You know, it's because we wanted to bring skylights to the lower level. The client was happy as a clam when I said, what if you put everybody in the same floor? He thought, this is great. This is very related to the way that I think about my company. He didn't think of it as a bad idea, you know? So does that answer the question, or am I avoiding the question?
I think it answers the question. I mean, from a student's perspective, from an academic perspective, I think, you know, we imagine projects to our detriment sometimes without clients, or we imagine projects for users without the intermediary of the client, which might be a public project. And so then the speculative dimension of how do I design something for someone without someone being able to say no or being offended by it in a speculative way without necessarily having that transactional environment of actual project.
By the same token, I don't want to sound like architecture in general and even any of these projects are really the result of idiosyncratic situations. I am always very much thinking of the long history of architecture. I am always very much thinking of how other architects have explored similar problems. And I think of each of these projects as a combination between a love letter and a critique of projects that have happened before them. So in looking at the SingleFamily Home, you know, is for me and my husband, I would have try that, let's say, on a different group of people if possible. Like I could build 20 of them and try to sell them, right? Because it's a combination between a critique of the single family home as a whole, but also a love letter to architects like Robert Metcalf, whose house I occupy in Michigan, right? So, and this is where the combination, I think, between this is where I think our job of being inventive really lies, to look at this moment in time, but also look at the long duration, what came before us, and what we want the future to be, right? How we imagine the future to be.
I have maybe a bit of a crude question. From the earlier sort of work, there's a lot of your components are about little aggregations,
yes.
The bricks, the plywood, the other ideas of sort of joinery and connection, etc. Is your trajectory sort of, maybe it's a total mystery?
No, it's okay.
Sort of going towards, these sort of balconies, the Cornian, there's not a single joint in that balcony.
There is, you just don't see it in the picture, but there is definitely. When you are there, you see it. It's really fat.
Denial of joinery, denial of connectivity. Is that sort of the trajectory that you're purposely on, or is it just happen to be?
No, I think that in every project, whether old or new, I've always been strategic about where I am going to invest in articulation and where I'm not going to invest in articulation, and vice versa, right? So in Conrad, the veils were extremely important, extremely expensive. Each of these cables, of course, had to be hooked by hand, right? So that meant, and the rest of the building was under the control of what I thought was not a very good contractor. So the rest had to be as simple as possible, so that there was very little chance for mess up, right? So in Pompano, the strategy was different. The strategy was, this is not a great contractor. Stucco is everywhere. They know how to do stucco. We can do different shapes that even if they're not perfect, nobody will know, right? So it's more strategic as to the condition, not the work research really moving away from notions of construction and materiality, but strategically deploying it as the context calls for it.
I guess relating back to Dean Curry's introduction, I'm curious about your thoughts on how you see form and capital intersecting in architecture and how that manifests.
So capital funds architecture. So it's at the base of what we do. So I think for me, the more important question is, when can architecture give back to everyday life? And then everyday life, then you can think of in terms of multiple activities that we deploy throughout the day, from public to private. That's really where the power of architecture is, right? So that's a broad architectural answer. As a practitioner, it gets really, really complicated. I have had clients approach me that I have said, no, I'm sorry, I cannot do this project, because they represented something I did not believe in. And at the other end of the spectrum, I have clients like Goldman Sachs, who perhaps I should not have taken, right? But towards which I feel a little bit more ambivalent, right? So, and these are decisions that I think are very personal, that each of us as architects takes when you take a client and when you don't take a client. And that's actually another aspect of capital. I mean, I had a client come to us at a moment where we really needed a client. And I said, I didn't even hesitate. I didn't even think about it. I said, no, I'm sorry, I cannot do this, So, and those are choices that each of you are going to have at one point in your careers. There are certain programs I will not do. I mean, there's no way I could do a correctional facility. There's no force in nature that will force me to do do you see what I mean? So, and I understand somebody has to do them, and that perhaps that's a naive attitude, but it is what you want to do as a person, right? So as I said, on the one hand, there is the fact that capital funds architecture, and then how that becomes a catalyst for us to effect change in the world. And at the other end of the spectrum, the personal choices that you make as an architect.
One more.
Wait, actually. You already have one. He hasn't had one.
So you know, the idea of capital at the beginning here was a little confusing to me, but the introduction was made me start to think about it in a different way. I don't know, Matt is referring to what we typically think of it as in terms of money and this sort of thing. I think
there's public capital as well, by the way.
That the dean was introducing it by relating it to other forms of capital, like political capital and social capital.
Yeah.
Is in a more metaphorical sense, what is the stored value of the enterprise, and where or how can you spend it?
Yeah.
You're talking about how the possibility for architecture to make these contributions to give back, and this sort of thing. So it seems to me, particularly in a
wait. Hold it there. I actually don't think of architecture as making contributions, and I don't think of architecture. You and I have had similar discussions about this. We're going to have a discussion we already had in private, in public. I actually don't think about. I am much more like optimistic and Pollyanna than I seem. I actually don't think of architecture as contribution and giving back. I actually think of architecture having a lot of power because we materialize culture. And by that, I don't mean we reflect culture. I actually think that the physicality of architecture can actually transform the way that we occupy space. And because it can transform the way that we occupy space, it actually has the power to affect the way that we live everyday life, right? So, which I know sounds like really, wow, seriously, architecture can do that? Yeah, actually, architecture can do that. So it's not a giving back. It's not a doing a favor to society. It's actually what we do as architects is shaping culture.
Right. I guess that was a poor word choice on my part. I was trying to get to the point where I could ask about, you know, it really represents, as you're describing now, the power that architecture has to do stuff in the world.
Yes.
We can choose to describe as giving back or contributing or whatever. But it relies on society or culture's acknowledgement through this kind of applied exchange that architecture has something that is desired or wanted. And that is something that I think architecture is a little bit in danger these days of losing ground, let's say, losing value. Its stock is lowering in comparison to other media that we see now in culture that have begun to take over some of the traditional responsibilities, let's say, that architecture originally had for placing us in the world and telling us how it was or should be. And so I'm wondering, looking at your work, you describe your work to a certain extent, as almost all architects do, in this society, as a reflection of the values that this society typically holds in terms that I would describe as engineering or planning based. And this is not a criticism. This is you're talking about how the program is distributed and how it's organized and this sort of stuff. But you're showing us images of super beguiling shapes, you know, forms and this sort of thing. I would submit that that's where the capital of architecture lies, that is not really well appreciated. And I think it's important for us as educators to emphasize that to the students and make them not be ashamed or embarrassed to talk about those sort of things, to somehow communicate the value that we believe it has through our actions to the people who otherwise are taught only to understand this in terms of dollars and cents or usable square footage or efficiencies or this sort of thing. And maybe, you know, come up with a language, you know, whatever it is, a poetics that allows us to communicate, to verbalize, let's say, which is otherwise so obviously communicated by the images But we have a little bit of trouble selling that, other than making the images and saying, yeah, this is what I want to do.
So this is where there might be a fundamental difference between you and me. I don't believe that there is the things that the public might care about in a project, like the organization of the building and the form of the building. For me, these two things are intertwined. There's a loose fit, of course, because, I might distort something slightly too much and, it's not efficient, quote unquote. But that excess is actually what makes architecture, and also that excess is what contributes to thinking about culture differently, right? But they're not separate. In other words, there's no project where I have fulfilled, quote unquote, programmatic requirements and then had to sell to the client the form or the architecture. The form and the architecture are the result, are the contingent, are the cause, are the enabler, are the everything in relationship to the other needs that the client may or may not have. The other thing to keep in mind is that clients are fleeting. I am not big, this is going to be shocking, I am not big in the notion of quote unquote community participation. I think it's a falsehood. I think all architecture is community participation. You are always, as an architect, working with communities. You are always, as an architect, working with many, many, many more people than you. So those architects that claim community participation as the heart of what they do, I find it very suspicious, because I've never worked in a project in my life that there was no community participation, from the first one to the last one. Even a residential project, there is community participation because you're dealing with the neighbors, right? So one thing that for me is important is that, yes, you're working with this one client today, but actually the project is going to live beyond the client, and that you are working not just with that one client, but you're actually working with a long duration of architecture. So how do you balance these longer time ideas with that one moment in time and that group of people at that moment, right? So like the head of the Broward County Library System left the Broward system before the building was completed, after driving so much of the process. But it doesn't really matter, because he was actually giving voice to certain ideas that needed to be understood and addressed, right? So, other questions? Oh, you had a question. Oh, sure. Yeah. So the question was, for those communities where those who are making decisions, where there's not enough diversity among those who are making decisions, how do you ensure a broader way of, how do you ensure more community participation? I mean, different architects do different things. I have pushed ideas of focus groups onto clients because I want them to hear multiple voices, and I want them to understand what, again, the bigger life of the project. And that has become more and more the norm. So I think these kind of processes are so much now part of what we do as architects, that I am not, how can I say this? I think that the techniques are quite obvious. You want to do a series of focus groups at the beginning of the project before you draw anything. Like you said, you want to ensure that certain people in the community are at the table so that your client can hear them. But more and more, the clients are coming to us with these kinds of techniques, and it's less us going to them with these kinds of techniques. So.
This is your opinion, do you think that as architects, designers, we have more agency to, say, distribute capital spatially in architecture and physical space toward advocacy is being encouraged. He talks about, like, for instance, for a particular need that we know exists in our culture, it's not being met, housing, for instance. Do we have more agency to do that as practitioners in the kind of a heterogeneous practice, working for expensive private clients and public agencies, or to target, say, I'm just going to work toward that one focus, but maybe, you know, to the exclusion of other market forces in terms of the agency you would have in practice, and voice as an architect. What is your opinion of that?
I don't know. I mean, one of the programs that I have tried for decades to work on is low-income housing. And I have tried in Boston. I have tried in Detroit. I have tried in multiple places. And no matter how I try to construct the situation, it always falls apart. And sometimes it falls apart in surprising places. So that's actually where the limit of the power of architecture comes into play. I think architecture might be less adept at putting in motion certain programs in certain places, and that we do need to rely on other disciplines to put in motion certain programs in certain places. For example, in Detroit, it turned out to be the neighbors that didn't want low-income housing, and then the city planner, because the neighbors didn't want it, he wanted luxury housing, to my shock, after I had the developer lined up to do it. So I that actually to me is sort of the other end of the spectrum, where the limit of the power of the architect comes into play. That doesn't mean that we don't stop or that we don't continue with our obsessions, right?
So getting back to what Jeff said, and also what James talked about, the capital aspect. What I've noticed in showing your projects is that you were finding ways of even using materiality to find ways of being innovative, yet deal with the capital that you were given.
Correct.
And so, you know, there's always this issue of how much voice do we have? How much agency are we given? And sometimes it is a question of taking risks, right? Because if we are to try to influence a client to go a certain direction, then that might end up making us lose the project. So, have you thought about this notion of capital beyond, I mean, we just gave you the steam?
Yeah, of course, definitely. I mean, you are constantly thinking of resources, and you're constantly thinking of how you're going to deploy resources within a project. You're also thinking of intellectual capital, the kind of value that I mean, we are experts, and we operate as experts within the construction industry, right? So yeah, definitely for me, capital has been central to everything we do as architects.
So you talked about a lot of conflict and having conflict between different sort of opinions in your projects, and also just now with the low-income development program that you attempted. I was wondering, do you believe that there is always like a solution to be found to those problems and conflicts? Or do you believe that there are problems and conflicts that are sort of not solved?
Yeah, I never thought of it as conflict. So therefore, I think, I always think that it's a solution. I think of it as an opportunity. I think of it as a different point of view. I think of it as a twist in the road. I don't know. For me, it's been a slightly different mentality. I always like to think of all the design moves as being, what you're calling conflict, I always thought of it as alibis. And the reason I like alibi is because alibis can be true or they can be false, meaning you can focus on certain aspects of the project as a way of arriving at certain geometries, forms, configurations, materials, etc., right? Whereas you can sort of be very pragmatic about others and ignore them a little bit. So I never actually thought of it as necessarily conflict. Although I understand where you're coming from. Now that I think about the way that I've been describing things, yes, of course they sound like conflicts.